Hello and welcome to this SIPA discussion on Navalny's imprisonment and Russia's future. I'm Edward Lucas, I'm a non-resident fellow at SIPA, and I'm joined here with four guests, different parts of the world. From Moscow, we have Zhanna Nemtsova. In Washington, DC, we have Alina, Polyakova, the CEO and president of SIPA, and also our board member, Thomas Firestone, who knows Russia very well. And then we have, joining us from Vilnius, the former Lithuanian foreign minister, Linas Linkevičius, one of the real heavyweights of European diplomacy and someone who's taken a tremendous interest in the cause of Russian democracy over the years. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and if you've enjoyed this discussion, do please share it on social media, on Twitter or Facebook or any other platform that you have access to. So Zhanna, I'm going to come to you first. What's the mood in Russia? I don't suppose that the demonstrators thought that they could stop this travesty of a trial happening, but the turnout was a bit smaller than at the weekend. Do you think the momentum is now with the protesters or is it with the authorities?
So it's difficult to say about all the Russians. Actually, I could describe my own experiences with everything which is going on in Russia right now. But first of all, I attended the protest in Nizhny Novgorod. I was born and raised in Nizhny Novgorod. My father was governor of the province of Nizhny Novgorod in the early 90s. In Nizhny Novgorod, it was the biggest demonstration in the history of our city. I think that there are different estimates, but from 5,000 to 10,000 people took to the streets in support of Alexei Navalny, but also against Vladimir Putin and his regime. Mostly young people between the age of 20 and 40. Lots of law enforcement officers were there, but it remained, so they behaved more or less normally, if I can put it that way. In contrast to what happened in a week, when once again, thousands of Russians took to the streets across our country. So there were so many law enforcement officers, so that you couldn't just imagine it, how many there were in the streets. And of course, they got much more violent than they had been on the 23rd of January. And yesterday, I was around the court. I wanted to support Alexei Navalny, but I couldn't get to the building because there were, once again, thousands of policemen, special forces, etc., and they detained around 200 people. And I was very lucky not to be detained yesterday. So first of all, I think that, of course, the Kremlin has everything right now. So they have, I think that the Kremlin has taken the decision to use only force against any dissenters, against those who actually take part in protests, against those who speak out on social media, etc., etc.
So Zhanna, let me jump in there. So you think that the Kremlin it's shown its willingness to use force, it's shown political determination to put Navalny behind bars. What happens next, do you think?
Well, nobody can say that regarding Alexei Navalny. So I think that everybody here understands it perfectly well, that it was a personal decision of Vladimir Putin to put Navalny in jail because he's extremely afraid of Alexei Navalny. He is the most powerful voice in Russia. His documentary about Putin's palace was watched by more than 100 million people. And he has a lot of support as well. Also Putin, or probably his team, they understand that Putin has lost a lot of his support. He has lost his legitimacy, and there is literally no chance to regain his popularity among Russians. So he has nothing to offer. We are in a crisis, in an economic crisis. people do not believe that much to what they are feeding them using Russian television stations. The internet is getting more and more powerful, and it's becoming the major source of information for many, many people. And so we are in a political crisis right now in Russia.
Well, let me turn to Linas Linkevičius, because you've described, I think, very clearly the way in which the Kremlin, if you like, has this tactical advantage, but it's strategically in a very difficult position because things are changing. Linas, you've watched developments in Russia over many years. The governments in which you served did a tremendous amount to help Russian Democrats, to shelter them in Vilnius, and to raise the question of human rights and freedom in Russia. Do you think that Russia's now gone through a kind of fundamental change, or are we in a sort of more of a Belarus situation where the opposition can demonstrate that the authorities can hang on?
Well, difficult to say for Russians to decide how big is threshold of patience for them, and when this tsunami of patience will come in. It's a matter of time. And when talking to our friends, to Zhanna and probably to Vladimir Karamurza and others, they're saying that things can change very rapidly and nobody knows when. But the fact is that they themselves, they will make a change. But for me, it's very important also in the international community and how it's the reaction. Sometimes, or very often, it's too late and too little. And this pragmatism and so-called flexibility always taking over at the expense of values, which is really alarming. And I believe it's time for reality check, what's going on. And now again, we see these contacts with the Kremlin, Kremlin going va-bank, mobilized ranks, all these dictators, also, I would say, Lukashenko and Putin, and neglecting own people, abusing them, and frankly, saving time for survival. But the situation is changing, and they count on tolerance of international community because our sanctions are really very limited scope. They, as I said, coming too late. We are not going into the closest circle of dictators. And this is lamentable. I believe we have to also to draw some conclusions out of that. And we will not change Russia, but we really can change the environment and back up the civil society, which is really waking up. And we can see that.
Well, let me turn straight then to you, Thomas Firestone, because as a lawyer and someone who knows the situation in Russia very well, but also the international legal environment, what's your take on this? Are you encouraged by the international reaction? Do you think we're still going for kind of performative sanctions that feel good but don't bite, or do you think there's now a real chance that we might do something that, as Minister Linkevičius was saying, will change the international environment and give some support to the protesters?
Thank you, Edward. First of all, I just want to express my enormous respect for the Russians who have gone out on the streets, Navalny and the First Order and everyone else, including people like Zhanna. I was glued to Dozhd TV yesterday all day watching the courtroom proceedings and then the consequences of that in the street protests. And I have just the highest respect for Russians who went out and were arrested by the police and were undeterred. So I think we all owe them a lot of respect internationally. In terms of what the international community can do, I get the sense that the Biden administration would like to improve relations with Russia. They're working obviously on New START, and that was the subject of the first discussion that Biden had with Putin. At the same time, though, I think their hand is going to be forced towards more sanctions because of these events. And God forbid Navalny is killed in custody, that will, of course, ratchet up the sanctions. We've had sanctions on them since 2014, since the Ukraine invasion. They're still in Crimea. I think that it's a matter, the sanctions have some effect, but I don't think that they're going to be effective at getting regime change. I think they're more symbolic. It hurts the economy a little bit. It makes it more difficult to do business. It's reduced the US investment in Russia. This is a big matter of debate within the legal and political science communities. When we look at Iran, we look at Cuba, we've had sanctions on those regimes for years and years and years now, and they have not produced regime change. On the other hand, of course, the fact that the Russians so want to get the sanctions lifted indicates that there's some resonance there. Navalny's team has obviously sent a letter to President Biden with 35 names, 8 identified as priorities for new sanctions, trying to get even closer into the inner circle and hitting some of the big oligarchs. If that were to happen, I think that that would have some effect, but I don't know that it would have an effect on regime change, nor do I think it would have an effect on the Navalny situation, because the government there has clearly decided that he is a major threat and they're going to do what they need to do to get him under control, and worrying about business with the West is going to be second priority.
Alina, what's your take on that? Because as well as running SIPA, you also have really looked hard from an academic point of view at these things. Are we in danger of putting too much emphasis on kind of Western stuff that isn't really going to happen, but it's fun to campaign for? Or should we be really just saying, in the end, it's only Russians can change Russia, and whatever we do is marginal? Or is there some magic bullet that we could fire but haven't?
Well, I think it is absolutely true that it should be up to the Russian people to change Russia. But the kind of repression that Zhanna just described, and we've seen all over the news over the last several weeks, clearly shows that the Russian people, in demanding their rights, are at a huge disadvantage against a state that has, for the last 10 years, been preparing for this moment, building up security and police forces and apparatus to be able to roll out the kind of repression that we've been seeing. And I don't think we know what the limit of that repression is. I think certainly the Kremlin has been trying to walk a very fine line between too much repression and violence that will likely mobilize more people and politicize more people in Russia if they see quite aggressive, violent Tiananmen Square kind of repressive moves. But that hasn't happened yet, but it doesn't mean it won't. And it presents a really difficult situation, I think, for the Biden administration, new US administration. And Russia was not a stated foreign policy priority for this administration, but certainly Russia has a way, and certainly Mr. Putin has a way of making themselves a priority. So like it or not, they have to deal. I mean, the US has to deal with this problem. And they want to reassess their Russia policy. That's been clearly stated, but unfortunately, as events are unfolding so rapidly, we often don't have the time. And I agree with Tom, of course, that sanctions in themselves it's really hard to produce behavioral change with sanctions. We've seen that in Russia, we've seen that in many other cases, but I don't think that is the purpose of these particular sanctions. I think the purpose should be to show that there are consequences for the kind of human rights violations, the kind of repressive tactics the regime has been rolling out against innocent people who are trying to express their freedom of speech and their basic political rights. So I think the targeted sanctions that have been proposed, this is something the administration can do very quickly. They have the authorities under existing CATSA and Ukraine executive order authorities to do so. They can do it quickly, and I think they should, because it would show a strong sign of force that this is a change from the previous administration, which did impose sanctions on Russia in various ways, but certainly didn't do it very quickly and somewhat begrudgingly, to say the least. And I think we need to show that we're supporting the Russian people's cause here. And that is what these sanctions, these targeted sanctions against specific Russian individuals will do. Will they change the Kremlin's domestic priorities, which are to prevent any sort of mass movement, these demonstrations from unfolding? I don't think so. But again, I don't think that's the purpose here. I think the purpose is to show support.
It's really tricky, this sanctions question, because it can also be instrumentalized inside Russia by the Kremlin as a way of punishing the opposition, that if you're against the Kremlin and the West is against the Kremlin, then therefore you must be in favor of sanctions, and therefore that's even a criminal offense. So there's dangers of sort of negative feedback loops here. But I want to park the question of sanctions for a bit and go back to what's happening inside Russia, because this is super interesting. And we've seen for 20 years the Kremlin exploiting the fears of instability and chaos and the trauma of the 1990s and saying, yes, well, it may not be great, but at least tomorrow is going to be better than yesterday, and yesterday was better than the day before that, and it's kind of worked. There's been a combination of soft repression and a degree of public consent and the stifling of political competition have all sort of combined to keep Mr. Putin in power for 20 years. And I want to go back to you now, Zhanna, and ask you, if you cast your mind back to the Bolotnaya protests 10 years ago, what's different this time around? Is it that we have a clear leader in the shape of Alexei Navalny? Is it because the economy is worse? Is it because the people are more bored with Putin? Is it that the demonstrations are bigger, or all of the above? But what's the difference between now and 2010, 2011?
Thank you. But before I answer your question, I just want to make a little comment about sanctions. So I believe that there is an intention on the part of the our State Duma to introduce a new article into the Russian criminal court to be able to prosecute those people who are calling on the European Union or the United States to introduce sanctions. So they are going to criminalize such calls. And so it's a disturbing signal, and you can draw conclusions by yourselves why they're planning to do so. I think that now, of course, I'm not an expert. I'm a journalist, but I think it is different in some ways. First of all, I think that there is a generational crisis, a generational conflict between younger people and older people. It's a generational conflict at large. It's very deep. And it's one difference. So not all the protesters, but most of them are really young people. Second, I think that those protests that we saw back in 2011, 2012, these were protests of middle-class people. If you remember, Alexei Kudrin took part in the protests in Bolotnaya. And what now? I haven't heard anything from Mr. Kudrin, who now works for Putin. He refrains from making comments. Why so? Has he changed his views? I don't know. I'm afraid I make any comments on that. So I'm waiting. Well. So, and it's also, I think there were protests back there in many cities, but now it's a national political movement, and it's clearly against Vladimir Putin and his regime. And I think these are two major differences. And of course, now, if you look at the Russian political regime, you can no longer say that it is a flawed democracy or an authoritarian regime, or it is a hybrid regime. We have some democratic institutions here. No, we don't have any democratic institutions here. It is a dictatorship based on force. Several years ago, Putin used other tools. He bribed people. He tried to buy loyalty. Now, end of the story. If you are against Vladimir Putin and his regime, so you will face court trials in Russia, and you can be arrested, you can be fined, you can lose your jobs, and that's what's happening right now. That's it. So that's one phase of Putin's rule. Of course, I do agree with Mr. Linkevičius. We cannot predict when exactly Putin steps down, but we're in the final stage, so it can last for another 5 or 10 years. But I believe that the best solution nowadays, and the only peaceful solution, is for Putin to step down. Otherwise, yes, we cannot predict anything. It can be worse and worse.
Linas, coming to you next. Lithuania has really pioneered this kind of soft power help for Russians. You have conferences of Russian Democrats, you have the Sakharov Center. For the Belarusians, you have the European Humanities University. Do you think there's more that we can do, not so much on the sanctions side, but on other things to undermine the regime and to promote the opposition and to help them? Is there anything in our toolkit that we're not doing, that we don't do, or that we do a bit of, but we could do more of?
Well, definitely. Well, first on sanctions, definitely cannot solve situation just by sanctions. Even having the fact that they are limited scope, as I said. When I'm asked, and very often, that sanctions are not working, so why we are doing this? So I'm always saying, let's add sanctions. And let's go after Putin's money, for instance, what we're not doing. And this is first point I would like to say. Then we have to seriously be engaged in the relations with civil society, already mentioned. In European Union, we've also agreed on 5 points, priority areas in relations with the European Union, which is not terribly unexpected. It's selective engagement, again, these sanctions, cooperation, but also contacts with civil society, which is not going in a regular way, I believe, and it's not systematic. And when leaders going to Moscow, queuing to visit the Kremlin, if not accepted to Kremlin, so going to Sochi, but very not often meeting civil society again, and not meeting opposition. I believe it's wrong. This is also should be done. What you mentioned, we are hosting these opposition people and media and those who expelled from the country, and also from Belarus lately, many people coming, up to 1,000. We issued these visas for humanitarian reasons. They all believe they will come back, of course, but nevertheless, it's a refuge for them. So this is also very important backup. Everyone should do that. So we really can do a lot in having these channels of communications with those who really taking their lives at risk, really losing comfort. And I'm always saying that while responding to this criticism, that look, Zhanna mentioned more than 100 million observed this Putin's Palace movie, and in the streets were just 40,000, one can see. So few, so not so many protesting. But you should understand how huge is power, so to say, of these power structures and this terrorism. And we have seen in the streets what's going on. So for the people, very difficult to protest. So we should understand that they are silently preparing for something and not necessarily going to the streets. So we should understand that they will be ready to do more. But again, we cannot do for them. We cannot do for them, but we should show empathy, but it's not enough. We should also back up their activity when it is possible. And we are not doing enough, so I'm convinced, and it's definitely the case. And this is applicable not only to Russia, but also to Belarus.
Thanks so much, Linas. And you mentioned those videos, and I would say to anybody who's watching this on the internet, please, when you finish watching this, do go to YouTube and watch the Navalny videos. You don't need to speak Russian. They're all subtitled in English. And they're a really gripping catalogue of the abuse of power, the looting of Russia, the colossally luxurious lifestyles involved in a country where an awful lot of people are living in poverty. But Thomas, I want to ask you about on this, that all this corruption happens not just inside Russia, but with accomplices in the West, bankers and lawyers and accountants and other people who enable this, whether it's through offshore, onshore finance, concealing beneficial ownership, and so on. And it strikes me that one of the things that the West could do, which isn't exactly sanctions, but is to really go after this corrupt Russian money and the people who enable it. It might hurt a bit. It would hurt the city of London. It might hurt the state of Delaware and the New York or Miami real estate markets. But it would put pressure on the Kremlin. It would also restore the West's credibility in the eyes of many Russians who say, you're just as bad as the Kremlin. You're just all getting rich at our expense. Do you see more scope for activity there?
I absolutely do. And before that's an excellent question. I just wanted to on the question you asked Zhanna about what's different between now and Bolotnaya. I was in Russia at the time of Bolotnaya until 2013, and I've been watching what's happening now. And sometimes when you're away from a situation, then you come back to see it, the contrasts jump out at you. And I just wanted to say 2 words on that because the differences jumped out at me on a number of levels. One is that I think that the opposition has gotten much more sophisticated in the intervening 10 years. You know, Bolotnaya, people were in their 20s and 30s are now in their 30s and 40s, and they've really perfected the use of social media in a way that they hadn't 10 years ago. At the same time, they seem to be supplemented by a younger generation, which is coming into this, of people who might have been 10 years old at that time, who are now not afraid to go out on the streets. Also, the videos that you mentioned, I think, you know, in the intervening 10 years, Navalny and his team have put out all of these videos documenting corruption and exactly what you're talking about, property and London and wherever else, extremely well documented. So we now have a documentary record supporting what they're saying, which we didn't have before. And in addition, I think that Navalny, just his public perception has changed in the last 10 years. I remember at the time of Bolotnaya, people didn't really know who he was. He was new on the political scene. You'd hear a lot of people saying that he was, Kremlovsky project, or, maybe he was working at somebody's, order, commission. And now the extraordinary events of the last 6 months with him being poisoned, recovering from the poisoning, identifying on tape the person who poisoned him and getting that person to admit to it. There's never been anything like that before. Coming back to Russia, knowing what was going to happen to him and going straight to jail without any fear has, to me, given him a moral authority, which he didn't have 10 years ago. And I think all of that is coming together, and I'd certainly be interested in Zhanna's reaction to that. Now I want to get to the question you did actually.
Okay, no, that was a great answer. Now we'll have the second answer.
The question you actually wanted me to weigh in on, which is going after the assets. I think this is extremely important. A lot of my work as a lawyer is in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act allows the US government to prosecute companies for paying bribes overseas. We see a huge number of those cases. They do it very well. What we don't see is cases against the bribe demanders. Now, bribery only works if there's a giver and a taker. The US enforcement efforts are overwhelmingly slanted against the givers, and that's for various legal and practical reasons. I think we need to do much more against the bribe takers. I do think that the scope for that is expanding now. We've seen some new legislation. The Corporate Transparency Act will make it impossible to use anonymous shell companies in the US, which ironically for the US and all of our preaching about combating money laundering, we were the great haven for money laundering because of the ease of setting up anonymous shell companies. So that's a step in the right direction. There are other new provisions in the FY21 National Defense Authorization Act, which will also facilitate this, including a new rewards program for those who identify kleptocratic assets and help in their recovery. So I think all of that is good. I think we're moving in the right direction with that. We need to do more in that. Ultimately, as a former prosecutor, I can tell you these cases can be extremely difficult to make because the assets are hidden under multiple offshore companies and more multiple offshore companies. And ultimately, to make these cases, you've got to prove the criminal source of the funds. The criminal source of the funds is usually going to be some sort of rigged privatization in Russia 20 years ago. That's hard to prove, and you're dependent on the foreign government for the evidence. They're not going to cooperate. So that's why these cases are so difficult. But what we can do is go after the enablers when they turn a blind eye to somebody coming in with a suitcase full of stolen cash and they want to buy real estate or art or something like that. We see movement in that direction, but I think Congress needs to do more in that direction.
Well, I would love to see closer integration of the criminal justice system with national security priorities. And I certainly get the impression that for the FBI and DOJ, prosecuting foreign corruption in foreign countries, even if there's some kind of US connection, is not necessarily seen as a career maker. And it may be a career breaker because it's going to be time consuming and expensive. And I think that simply shifting the priorities a bit and saying this corruption is actually bad for the United States, even though it's mainly happening in other countries, would send a powerful message. But I want to come, Alina, do you want to jump in on any of that? Because I want to come as a final round. I want to ask all the panelists what we should do about the, I was going to say 2021 parliamentary elections, but I don't really like the phrase parliamentary elections. It's not really a parliament, and they're not really elections. So there's a kind of electoral event, let's call it that, happening for the so-called Duma. And Navalny pioneered the idea of intelligent voting, of just piling in behind the candidate who's most likely to beat the Kremlin candidate, whether that was a communist or whatever. I'd be interested to know whether that's still on the is the desirable way forward, or whether we need to shun the political system already and boycott it. So that's my sort of final round. But Alina, first of all, do you want to pick up on any of either what Thomas's first answer or his second answer?
Well, just very quickly, I wanted to emphasize something that Tom just alluded to about the sophistication of the democratic opposition in Russia today versus 10 years ago. And I think the big difference here is, of course, not just the use of social media, but the penetration of various social media across Russia. All of Navalny's videos are on YouTube. He uses Twitter, Instagram, every single possible platform that he possibly can. And I think if it wasn't for these Western companies still being able to operate inside of Russia, it'd be very, very difficult for the Russian opposition to be as sophisticated and as impactful as they've managed to be, despite being locked out of state-controlled media, which controls a huge chunk and the majority of the Russian information environment. And so I think this connects to the United States because, of course, right now there's a lot of anger in the US about our social media, but I think we need to really proceed carefully because if it wasn't for these platforms, and Telegram being another one founded by a Russian entrepreneur some days ago that has embarrassed the Kremlin on multiple occasions. And we have to be really careful that in our desire to regulate these companies, that we don't block the availability of these platforms to dissidents, to demonstrators, to pro-democracy activists. It's been, I think, I'd love to hear from Zhanna on this. I think if these companies didn't exist in Russia, just like they don't exist in China, we would not have what we have today with this kind of national mobilization movement that Navalny and many others around him have been able to really do. And I think that's really, really significant.
So Zhanna, let's come straight to you on that, on the both on the role of technology and particularly Western technology platforms. I guess as Mr. Durov is now living abroad, I guess we have to call Telegram a foreign technology platform. And also and I know you're a journalist, not an opposition leader, but from your point of view, do you think we should just forget the so-called elections this year, or is it still worth going for intelligent voting? And what's the game plan for the next few months?
Okay, just want to make short comments on what Thomas mentioned. I do agree with you completely. And just to add that protesters now are, in my opinion, much more fearless. I saw them directly confronting policemen, and they were fearless. And that was really, really impressive. Well, I do agree with Alina. Yes, technology has played a very important role in forming the perceptions of Russians and in changing their attitude towards the Kremlin and its actions. And I think that the biggest impact, that YouTube has so far the biggest impact. So YouTube has grown dramatically in the last couple of years. But I just want to say to you about perceptions of Navalny. I think that people's perceptions changed exactly 6 months ago, or probably 4 months ago, when Navalny was poisoned. Then he managed to survive and he managed to solve his case. And that was very persuasive. And of course, his documentary played a very important role. So people do not longer believe that he is a Kremlin agent. He gets his funds from the Kremlin. He's now, first of all, he's known by literally everyone in Russia. And of course, he's supported by more people than he used to be supported probably 6 months ago. That's important. Well, about the upcoming elections. Well, taking the latest developments in Russia, it's difficult to predict, but I think that the Kremlin will do everything to try not to include anybody on the list who is not loyal to Putin or to the United Russia. So they will be really careful with these elections because, of course, they hate Navalny's smart voting practice. I think they will do that. And of course, these elections will be fraudulent. I don't know how it will play out with the smart voting this time. And also, just one thing, you have to understand that not only Navalny is behind the bars, but many others, including Lyubov Sobol and Navalny's brother Oleg Navalny, and Navalny's press person Kira Yarmysh, all of them are under home arrest until the 23rd of March. So they basically opened another criminal investigation over so-called violations of sanitary and epidemiological standards. Or it's quite an exotic article of the criminal code that has never been applied before. And you have to understand there is no lockdown in Russia, nothing. So we have already won the battle with the coronavirus, you know, and so you don't have to wear masks and everything is open. Well, and they can actually jail them, or they can, these people can stay under home arrest for years. So they will try to get rid of any prominent, all the prominent actually opposition leaders. And we cannot count on the upcoming elections for change, I mean.
Well, that's a bleak prospect in the short term. And I think and the most encouraging thing I've taken from this is the very important point that the people have lost their fear and they're beginning to feel anger. And this is not just in Moscow middle classes, but going all over Russia. And the thing that I spend a lot of time doing is reading regional Russian newspapers and websites now, because I get the impression that the Kremlin's information monopoly, although it's still very strong at the center on the big channels, I'm seeing quite a lot of quite lively discussion in some of the regional websites, and I get a feeling that's new a bit. And there's also the demonstrations in Khabarovsk, and the big controversy in the Sakha Republic in Yakutsk about the mayor there. So I wonder if the regions are going to be the place where the system begins to break first. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's a question for me.
I wonder about whether the regions may be more important than Moscow now.
We can see that I cannot say that their actions will be decisive, but we can see that regions right now are very active, and they have vibrant civil societies in many regions. And it's also because of the network of Navalny's campaign offices. So they've been very effective working in those regions. And of course, now you cannot see this gap between Moscow and other regions. I mean, I saw young people in Moscow, I saw young people in Nizhny Novgorod protesting. So these, they have similar views, similar attitudes, and that is because of the internet. I think that, well, Moscow and St. Petersburg are still very important. So these are two most populous cities inside Russia. But I think that the regions can play some role, and the economic situation in Russia's regions is much worse than in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And that is why people have even less hope for a better future in these regions, and they have less to lose. And I just want to highlight that, yes, those who take to the streets have literally no fear, but many people have fear. And these people, lots of them support the anti-Putin movement, but they prefer to stay at home and watch to what's happening. And I do agree with Mr. Linkevičius, because yes, they do not rely on any support coming from the West or from whatever country, and they understand that the risks are really high. So you can lose a job only because you take to the streets. Right. And so there is a lot of fear, but protesters are not afraid of anything.
We're almost out of time now, so I'm just going to ask people for sort of final thoughts. And Linas, can I ask you, what do you pay attention to? You know this really, really well. You've spent years and years dealing with Russian officials. Do you think we should be looking for cracks at the top, for the regime crumbling at the bottom? Should we be looking at defections in the regions? What would be your advice to people who are watching this broadcast and who want to know how to understand Russia? Where should they be looking?
In short, my advice would be, again, coming back to Russians, up to Russians how they will be active, and it's difficult to judge. But for me, it's again most important international reaction, which I would repeat, it's not sufficient. And this is not just about sanctions. It's also, we shouldn't help regime to present situation as usual business, because for them it's very important. And all these visits without any results, or invitation of Putin to World Economic Forum, for instance, what I was really, not just me, but many others were questioning why it's happening. And by the way, paradoxically, he was speaking, as you remember, about elevation of poverty. So after this documentary of Putin Balance, it was very, very to the point, and I was also tweeting. Maybe Putin used some slides from Navalny when presenting this fight with poverty. So this is really something what we shouldn't do. We should avoid isolation where it is possible, showing that it's not business as usual, and also real meaningful sanctions. So least we can do in support of civil society, what we're not doing in systematic ways. So this is exactly the case. The rest and the most important part, of course, will be played by Russians themselves.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for mentioning your Twitter account. And I would urge anyone who's watching this to follow Linas Linkevičius on Twitter, and particularly I think that since you've left the foreign ministry, your sense of humor has been unleashed, and you're allowed to say things that are extremely funny and not so diplomatic. So that's really, it's really very, very, very welcome, and I recommend that. Thomas, you know Russia pretty well. What would you urge people to concentrate on, either in terms of analysis or in terms of doing?
I think it's something that you just mentioned, cracks at the top of the structure. Mark Gagliardi, whom we all know, wrote an excellent article on this morning. I saw Richard Haas making the same point, in that when regimes crumble, it tends to be with the complicity and involvement of people at the top as well as the people on the streets. So I think we've got to look at what's happening in the elites and the relationship of the elites to Putin.
Good. And final word from you, Alina. Round us off.
Well, I just think that there's a lot of misperceptions about what Russian people think, who they support, who they don't support. And I think we need to be really mindful that we're not reproducing basically the Kremlin's own narrative, the Kremlin's own propaganda, that Putin has widespread support across the country, that his approval ratings are very high for a reason, because he's a great leader, and that what can really a couple 100,000 people on the streets really accomplish. I think we have to remember that Russia is not a country where people have choice in their politics. They don't have choice in their economic well-being and prosperity going forward. And when you don't have political choice, and the elections are fraudulent and shouldn't even be called elections at the end of the day, of course you're going to have high approval ratings, because Putin has systematically destroyed any real competition to himself. And I think now he has placed himself in an incredibly insecure position, and opened himself to a lot of vulnerabilities in terms of challenges from the bottom, and also from among his own factions around him. So we just have to be very careful to understand that in an authoritarian state, poll numbers are not what they are in a democracy. And I'll just end on that. I just want to really thank Zhanna for joining us from Moscow. It was really wonderful to see you. And I think, I hope you know, and I think you do, that you and others on the streets, everyone's watching closely. We'll do anything we can to support you, and good luck.
Thank you.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Alina, for that. And it just remains for me to say, please do keep an eye on the SIPA website and on our Twitter feed. We do a lot on these subjects, and we'll do more. I think I want to end with a story, Zhanna, your father told me, which was that when Putin say people say Putin's popular, it's a bit like in a Soviet Stolovaya where there's only kasha to eat, and the manager says people love kasha. Look, they eat it. Of course they do, because there isn't anything else. And I think Alina's point about when people have political choice, then they can decide whether they like Navalny or Putin. But so long as Putin's saying you can't have political choice, it fundamentally weakens his legitimacy, particularly when that's emphasized and implemented through this use of legal and indeed physical repression. So on that note, I would like to thank Linas Linkevičius, the former foreign minister of Lithuania and a great friend of freedom in Russia and elsewhere. Zhanna Nemtsova, a journalist joining us from Russia. We wish you well and we salute your courage and the courage of all those other Russians. And then Thomas Firestone, our SIPA board member, joining us across the Atlantic. Alina, Polyakova, the CEO and president of SIPA, also from Washington, DC. And from me, Edward Lucas in London, goodbye. Thank you to the panelists and thank you to everyone who's been watching this broadcast.